Yes.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Oh, it's okay. Thank you. My name's Ross Kessick. Thanks for coming. I'm
Yeah,
also
Ross.
with co-founder of Constitutional Defenders of Texas. I just want to make a couple comments really quick because I know there's a lot of questions. But I would disagree that that impeachment really is the right course for some of the reasons you mentioned. The timeline isn't realistic to get it done before the election. I think this really speaks more to the problem with government bureaucracy and Congress delegating authority, basically giving the executive branch authority to make their own regulations outside of Congress. Not that it's unconstitutional, but just that it's inappropriate. And because then the bureaucracy can change whatever regulations they want as long as it's somewhat in the confines of the leeway that the legislative branch has given them in the statute, which allows them to exist in the first place.
So would you repeal the statutes that authorize the...
Yeah, we get rid of the government bureaucracy in the federal government and let the states have their own departments of health and human services if that's what the people in the state want.
So do a block grant, basically?
Don't ever send the money to the feds in the first place. We can just another quick comment. I think that Eric Holder issue is a little irrelevant, not because I'm a proponent of Eric Holder, but really because we can kind of kill two birds with one stone by just getting rid of Obama in November, which will get rid of Eric Holder. Because again, I don't think the time horizon is realistic in the meantime before the election. So I think it's a little bit of a wasted effort, although I think the contempt charge was good enough. In terms of
basically what our constituency demanded us that we do. Okay. And
right.
There's not always a real clear definition of the timeline. You get the timeline problem.
We can speculate about, yeah. The Medicaid mandates aren't good. You said Rick Perry is courageous in not participating in the exchanges that would fall under Obamacare. I agree with you. I just don't really see how they're any different than any other mandate from the federal government, the Department of Energy, the Department of Education. And I think we could avoid fighting a lot of these issues with the liberals if, once again, we just didn't send money to the federal government and left the states to regulate their own affairs. Since 2007 to 2010, nearly every government department that falls under the executive branch has grown anywhere from 30 to 300%. I don't see that ever changing. This leads to my question, is about the debt ceiling. So if conservative Republicans in Congress are going to vote to raise the debt ceiling nearly every time it comes up and is an issue, and I'm bringing this up to you because you're on the Ways and Means Committee, so it's appropriate. If conservatives are going to vote to raise the debt ceiling and delegate that authority to a committee who didn't come up with really a solution, then who can conservatives rely upon to stand up and represent our values and say no? Thank you.
Conservatives have a chance to vote whether they think the cuts that were made in exchange for the raising the debt ceiling were valid. Conservatives like Jeb Hensarling, Paul Ryan, conservatives that I rely on and look to, felt like it was the first time in history, the last time we raised the debt ceiling, it was the first time in history that we had a $2.2 trillion cut of the federal budget in exchange for raising the debt ceiling. It was the first time that the Senate agreed to have a balanced budget amendment even heard on the floor and take a vote on it. That was part of that deal. And so it was the first time that I've ever, since I've been in Congress, that we had some viable options for voting for a debt ceiling increase. But the other part of it is that in the federal bureaucracy, there is no defined person who says who gets paid and what priority if the debt ceiling is not raised.
But Congress can act through legislation to define.
Absolutely.
Right.
Toomey had good legislation.
Right.
And Paul had good legislation.
Right.
And that legislation has been reintroduced.
But by voting no, real quick, in the debt ceiling, the whole issue, that was the time to say no, which would have forced Congress to prioritize spending. And again, you say cuts were made but spending from the federal government, the increases continued on the same trajectory.
Again, it was the first time I was ever able to vote for a bill that cut federal spending at all.
But
Period.
it reduced an increase, and this is why I think we're losing the debate publicly, is that we're all calling them cuts, so the trajectory of increase went down, but the total amount of spending went up, so that's not a cut.
So do you agree with the Paul Ryan budget?
Not in principle, no, because and that's a good point. So I'm just saying that when we refer to it as a cut, it's really not calling a spade, and I think that's one of the reasons why conservatives, especially in office, had difficulty getting real things done, because we call them cuts and they're not cuts. Because there's automatic increases. So if we reduce the increase, we call it a cut. We're going to lose every time.
2/3 of the federal government are Medicare and Medicaid,
Right.
and Social Security. And those are not subject to any of the cuts. They're entitlements, and it's going to take legislation
Correct.
to lower those entitlements.
That's correct.